Just like that, the college football season is almost over. And, I remember doing these videos back in May and June, previewing a lot of these teams. And fast forward to now, who would have thought that we would have Miami versus Indiana? It was kind of fun watching some on three reports and kind of seeing what everybody's preseason predictions are compared to now. And I think that's what's so fun about college football is those kind of stories from the very beginning to now. But fast forward to January 19th, we have Miami and Indiana going at it. And I think this will definitely be a fun game. And, what I found probably most intriguing about all of this is the fact that Indiana is 8.5 point favorites in this game. And, quite frankly, there's a lot of reason to think that, right? For the most part, Indiana hasn't really shown a lot of weaknesses this year. They've been absolute juggernauts. Even that first pick six by D'Angelo Pons on Dante Moore's first pass of the game set the tone for the ass whooping that we saw. And Oregon deserves a lot of credit for the season that they had and everything, but Indiana just seems like that everything was just clicking all together. And I know a lot of people are making allegations of them cheating or whatnot. I'm not going to get into that because for people that watch the film, watch the tape, and watch the games, there isn't any sort of cheating going on. And if there ever were to be cheating, they will get caught sooner than later. So let's not worry about that. But with Indiana, you also have, Fernando Mendoza, who's been an absolute beast this season, will likely be the number one pick in the NFL draft, presumably going to the Raiders. And, he has more touchdown passes, 8 so far in the playoff, compared to incompletions so far in the playoff, which is only 5. And that's just an incredible stat. He's been so efficient. The guy just seems absolutely poised in every situation that he's in. And most importantly, his character and, just how he conducts himself on and off the field is just, a tremendous asset. And, no matter how this game turns out for him, Kurt Signetti, Mendoza, and the rest of this team should be really proud of themselves for how much they've overcome here. But Miami also deserves a lot of credit here too, right? To be able to start off the year, with a lot of good solid victories, then you're a little bit shaky towards the middle of the year, and then they kind of bounce back and they get a couple playoff wins versus a really tough Texas A&M team. Then they fight Ole Miss down to the wire, being able to take the lead with a minute left. And fast forward to now, we have a Miami team that just feels really way more complete compared to the beginning of the season, right? And I think who really deserves a lot of credit in this conversation is Carson Beck. And I'll admit there's been a time or two where I've maybe been critical of him, and I think a lot of people tend to be critical of him in the sense that he's not necessarily a guy that's going to always light up the box score or the stat sheets or anything, but his leadership and his intangibles and his skill set often shows up in different ways that isn't necessarily shown on a box score, right? And this criticism is not only from this season, but even the previous season as well under Georgia. A lot of people were kind of sleeping on and kind of dismissing him. And in general, what Carson Beck has definitely, lived up to the hype. And when they needed him most, he showed up. Now, granted, there were definitely some moments in the Ole Miss game where when that defensive line was able to get sustained pressure and got him off his rhythm and he wasn't able to completely get into those throws, there definitely were some times where you can argue, hey, he missed a throw, or hey, he ran a guy high, or whatever it is. But nevertheless, Miami, through their pass rush, through Carson Beck's accelerated play, through guys like Marion and Tony and Fletcher, all being really impressive playmakers for this team, everything just kind of is gelled together, and that's a big, large reason why we're talking about their first playoff appearance since 2003. But to me, my hot take about this playoff game is I think this game will be a blowout. I'm not necessarily saying it's going to be towards Miami or towards Indiana. I would probably lean more towards Indiana, just kind of given what we've seen from them this year. But the reason why I think it's a blowout is because in many ways, what both these teams have to do is primarily similar, right? if you're Miami, here's what I'm focusing on. Playing good, sound, fundamental football. Focus on your strengths. What are your strengths? Your pass rush and running the football. And what ultimately got Miami in the position that they did towards the end of that game was getting away, trying to get too cute, too clever, too creative when it was completely unnecessary. When you're averaging 3, 4, 5 yards a carry with a guy like Mark Fletcher, just let him eat. Let him play that power run game. Let that offensive line take care of business. When you know that you're more physical and more dominant and just all around a better aggressive unit than Ole Miss. And that leads me to believe, why can't they do the same thing versus Indiana's defensive line, right? Because granted, statistically speaking, Indiana has been one of the best defenses in the country. Those guys like Aiden Fisher and the rest of those boys up there, they have been mightily impressive this season. But the one thing that Indiana hasn't seen this year is they haven't seen a legit number one running back. Now, granted, we can go back and talk about Singleton from Penn State and Allen. You can make that argument as well. But I think that Penn State team wasn't at full force. And that's also the same reason why I'm kind of pushing back on the Oregon argument as well, since for the most part, two out of their 3 top running backs were hurt. And Alabama doesn't have any sort of rushing attack whatsoever, not even when Jam Miller's healthy. So to me, that's the big question. That's probably the one point I would make in this game in terms of where a potential weakness could be in Indiana. And that's not for me to say it is a weakness, but I'm saying if you can find a way to exploit a single weakness, that's the one that you have to find. Because the one other thing that is intriguing about Miami, and I think this is worthwhile, and this is something that Chris Fowler and Kirk Herbstreit both mentioned on the telecast, was they were one of the leaders in the ACC in terms of false starts. And I think especially if that Indiana defensive line can get home and cause Carson Beck to get out of rhythm, there's a possibility that this game could get ugly, just like it did, just like Indiana's game versus Oregon did. Because Miami also had 10 penalties versus Ole Miss, and a lot of them were in key critical moments where, they Miami did a really good job at setting themselves up in relatively short third down conversions, but it would always kind of be a false start or an unnecessary pass play that would ultimately make the drive fizzle and be a reason why this game ended up being closer than it really should have. And that's not me discrediting Ole Miss, because, in fact, a couple weeks ago, I even argued that Ole Miss could upset Georgia on the channel. So this is not me being an Ole Miss hater, but this is just me saying that the score, if you look outside the score, Miami had a lot of opportunities to dominate this game more than it was. And in many ways, they can definitely build on that in this Indiana game. Because if you ask me, if the true weakness of this Indiana team is their rushing attack, and Carson Beck continues to play the way he is, and you continue to get guys like Tony and Marion in space and could be really key playmakers, there's a possibility that we can be talking about a Miami team winning this game by 14, 17 points. I don't think that's really that crazy to say, especially when you have, guys like Mansour and Rueben Bain there too. Now, granted, they only had 1 sack versus Ole Miss, but there's a big difference between Chambliss's skill set versus Beck's. And what I will tell you is they got a lot more pressures than the box score would say. But what I also will say is they will definitely have more than 1 sack versus Indiana. That you can pretty much ride on, guarantee right here. I'm here to tell you that. But let's shift a little bit to Indiana, right? If you're Indiana, what are your keys to victory? To me, relatively similar to Miami, right? Besides, sticking to the fundamentals and just out scheming, all those kind of things, right? One of the big things for me that if you're Indiana, and I mentioned this a couple seconds ago, you have to get pressure on Carson Beck. There is no way around that. What Indiana was able to do both times versus Oregon is they were able to just get nonstop pressure on him to the point where Dante Moore just quite frankly felt rattled throughout the game. And that's a big reason why Indiana went into halftime with a 35-7 lead over Oregon. But if you're Indiana, you have to find a way to get pressure on Carson Beck, especially just how phenomenal he's been in these last two games. This will ultimately be the biggest test of his college football career. And like I said, Beck has faced a lot of scrutiny over the past couple seasons, both on and off the field. But I think he's going to play with a chip on his shoulder. But this Indiana defense really has to come in big, and not only in terms of the pass rush, but I would argue maybe even most importantly on the perimeter, right? Those cornerbacks, those linebackers, because what's Miami's bread and butter? Their bread and butter is getting those guys like Marion, Tony, Fletcher, you name it, those guys, using them in different spots on the football field, getting those quick routes when the power rushing attack, when they don't feel like doing that, getting on those quick screens, those quick slants, using the play action. Those difference makers are going to be the difference between Indiana winning by 17 versus possibly winning by 7 to ultimately losing the game, right? Because that's the one thing Indiana deserves a lot of credit for this season is they've played incredibly disciplined and sound football throughout this season. And you have to find ways to tackle in space. You can't give up a lot of yards after a catch. You can't give up silly, undisciplined plays like face mask and defensive holds. Now, granted, in the national championship game, they always let you play a little bit more than usual. But to me, it feels different in that sense because, granted, does Ole Miss have playmakers? Absolutely. But what Miami was able to do was they were able to shut down Harrison Wallace in a way that, hey, you took away your top guy. Kwan Lacey had his shoulder hurt, and now fast forward and you're playing an entirely different game if you're in Miami. And the thing, if you're Indiana as well, in terms of the offensive side of the ball, is I think you have to give a big compliment to them in the sense of just how great of a job they've done being able to prove that they can attack on both sides of the football. Now, granted, this stat that I'm about to share could be a little bit skewed, but the Hoosiers in their past 2 playoff games have ran the ball 90 times compared to just 36 passing attempts. Now, granted, that could just be how dominant some of these games were. And in fact, I think you can argue that, it's probably going to be a debate between this team versus the 2019 LSU team in terms of, the greatest college football teams of all time. I think that's a conversation we're going to have, not to mention them beating 94-25 combined in those games. But in any event, what you're going to find is how much are they really going to run the football, right? I think that's really the big question mark, because even if you want to count the Ohio State game in there, the ratio becomes 124-59. So I think there is a little bit of a skew simply because a lot of these games were kind of blowouts, and obviously you're not going to risk your guys getting hurt when there's really no reason to be attacking down the field. But what's Indiana's bread and butter, right? Their bread and butter is getting the rushing attack going and then trying to get as many guys in those boxes as possible. And then when you think you can get 7 or 8 guys in that box, you think you're going to create that pressure up front, bam, they're going to go with the play action and they're going to hit guys with one-on-one matchups on the outside. When you guys got guys like Elijah Surratt, like Charlie Becker, like Amar Cooper Jr., all those guys kind of coming together. And granted, this is all me to say that I truly believe that this game will not be close as I kind of go through these different things in terms of why certain teams will be successful. One of these situations are going to prevail in a very overwhelming way. And my gut tells me it's going to be Indiana, but don't be shocked if Miami just completely takes it to Indiana and wins by multiple possessions. But I think this could be a very fun matchup. I think both these teams have absolutely deserved to get there. And no matter what happens, they're building a ton of momentum for next season. But as it stands right now, I see this game being a blowout going either way. to me, it just feels like a tail of the tape where someone's going to hit that knockout punch early, and then the gas is just going to keep, and that throttle is going to keep on going. This does not seem like a game that's going to be a back and forth type of situation. This is going to be a game where one defense simply takes over and a rushing attack taking over. So very fun matchup that we have in this national championship game. And I'm excited to report back and break down the matchup at the